Alright guys, today we're going to be checking out an informational video from Football Iconic. How did Manchester United win the treble? Let's find out.
Can't believe it. I can't believe it. Football, bloody hell.
Ever since the creation of football in 1992, us fans have been witness to some of the most exciting teams and personalities the sport has to offer. English football in particular has produced some of the most iconic stories in football history, with some ridiculous achievements to boot. However, since the creation of football, and even stretching back to whatever it was called before 1992, only one English team has ever climbed to the very top and achieved a feat so rare that only 7 teams in all of Europe have accomplished it thus far. The fabled treble. A Premier League, an FA Cup, and a Champions League, all in the same season. Understandably, this was no easy feat. What started off with a man that very many people doubted in the beginning turned into arguably the crowning achievement in the history of the biggest club in English football, and it only took just over a decade. The story alone is pretty good, but the football itself was nothing other than phenomenal. But how was any of this possible? More specifically, how did Manchester United win the treble in 1999?
How did they do it?
Yo, what's good everyone? Trust you're all doing well and having a great day. Today we've got a special one coming up. We're going to be taking a look at how Manchester United climbed to the very pinnacle of club football. But before we do so, we're going to take a brief look into the history of Manchester United Football Club, the events that led to this achievement, as well as the characters that made the story so memorable. Because it's not about the destination, it's about the friends you made along the way.
Whoa!
Just a quick reminder, if you like the content, please feel free to smack that like button, but as always, only if you want to, no pressure. Also, just another quick reminder,
for me to learn about Manchester United's
history. The Champions League
history
has been known as the Champions League since 1992. Before that, it was known as the European Cup. I just don't want to confuse anyone when I interchange between the two names over the course of this video. Alright, That's enough waffle, let's get stuck in. Now, Man United has an extremely long and rich history. So much so that deciding where to start on this story was quite the task on its own. However, perhaps a great place to kick things off is to give a brief overview of Manchester United Football Club before 1986.
Okay.
By 1986, Manchester United were already well established as one of England's finest and most decorated clubs. In a nutshell, they'd won 7 league titles, 6 FA Cups, and 1 European Cup by that time. However, by this time in the club's history, United had quite literally been through hell and back. The dreadful tragedy of the Munich air disaster was still quite fresh in the minds of many involved with the club. Honestly, it still is, even to this day. On the 6th of February 1958, the entire Manchester United squad, who had just beaten Red Star Belgrade to qualify for the semi-final of the 1958 European Cup, had boarded onto a flight back to England. In a terrible turn of events, the plane carrying 44 people crash-landed, taking the lives of 20 on board, 8 of which were United players. Understandably, this dreadful event shook the club as well as the footballing world as a whole to its very core. The tragedy in itself is incredibly upsetting, but to add additional layers of tragedy to it, this team was rather formidable prior to the crash. Led by the legendary Sir Matt Busby, the team was in great shape at that point. They'd won the previous 2 seasons of the First Division back-to-back and were in the hunt for a third. Further to that, the average age of the team over these 2 seasons was roughly 22 years old. The Busby Babes.
Wow.
But, if anything, Manchester United is a club well known for its resilience. In the years that followed, there was understandably a period of transition. But it only took about 7 years for the club to climb back up to the top. Iconic footballers such as the United Trinity in Dennis Law, Bobby Charlton and George Best came in, stepped up and brought glory back to Old Trafford. In case you're unaware, all 3 of these players won the Ballon d'Or while playing for United during this period. These players, among others, contributed to a historic European Cup victory for the Red Devils in 1968. It's also worth noting that not only was this United's first European Cup victory, but it was also the first ever European trophy won by an English team. Yeah, United have been a big deal for quite some time now. Anyway, moving forward a few decades to late 1986, and despite a couple of FA Cup wins, United were not the high-flying team that they used to be. In fact, they were even relegated from the First Division in 1974, following the departures of Bobby Charlton and Dennis Law. This would also be George Best's last season at the club. Although, United did regain promotion immediately after being relegated and were even in an FA Cup final 2 years later in 1976. In any case, by the start of the 1986-87 season of the First Division, United had failed to make a legit title challenge in almost 2 decades. In fact, they were even under the very real threat of relegation once more, with only half the season played. In other words, something needed to be done. Meanwhile, in Scotland, a young manager was slowly but surely making a name for himself in Scottish football. 3 Scottish Premier Division victories, 4 Scottish Cups, and a European Cup Winners' Cup trophy between 1979 and 1986 were more than enough to attract the interest of Manchester United.
Ferguson.
When Alex Ferguson, as he was still referred to back then, arrived at Old Trafford on the 6th of November 1986, apart from the team's dreadful form, United had a few other problems too. For example, the 80s and even much of the 90s in English football was rife with a drinking culture. The players at Manchester United were not immune to this. Prominent United players such as Brian Robson, Norman Whiteside and Paul McGrath were at the forefront of this dilemma. When speaking on the club that he inherited, Ferguson once claimed that before he arrived, United were almost as much of a social club than a football club. Ferguson responded by applying a swift ban on alcohol and even went as far as employing a network of spies all around Manchester to alert him whenever one of his players was going off the rails. According to Mark Hughes, a former United striker, that's where he got his information from. It wasn't a bad tactic in those days because a lot of the lads were bouncing around nightclubs and thinking they were getting away with it. Spoiler alert. They weren't.
They were not.
In any case, after steadying the ship somewhat, Ferguson was able to manage United from 21st place in the league when he joined to an 11th place finish. As far as first seasons go, it really could have turned out much worse. The seasons that followed weren't laced with much consistency though. After finishing as runners-up in the league in his second season in England, United fell right back down to 11th the year after that. And midway through the 1989-90 season of the First Division, Ferguson's job was seriously at risk. With the team sitting just above the relegation zone and with them having last won a trophy 4 years prior to the season, things weren't looking all that great. Fans were not happy and were not afraid to show it. United's only real shot at silverware that season was the FA Cup, and if you're the type of person that believes everything they read in the news, this was Ferguson's only hope at retaining his job. I think we can all guess what happened next. United beat Crystal Palace in the FA Cup final and went on to win the European Cup Winners' Cup the very next season. More impressively, it was against Johan Cruyff's Barcelona Dream Team, a team that would go on to win the European Cup the very next season, as well as La Liga for 4 seasons in a row. With Barcelona. 2 cup victories in back-to-back seasons, it seemed that the faith in Fergie had returned, and that something special may have been on the horizon. Despite this, United was still off the mark in terms of title success. By 1992, it had been roughly 26 years since United had last won the league, something that Ferguson was eager to...
I'm gonna pause. That is... Guys, I waffle so much on who I support. 27... Okay, the Cowboys, it's been 27 years since the Dallas Cowboys have won a major title. Here we are sitting 26 years for Manchester United since they've won. It's kind of similar time period to go through of just being mediocre.
To rectify. By the inaugural season of the Premier League in 1992, United were looking the real deal. This was in large part due to the iconic team that Fergie had slowly built up over the years. Peter Schmeichel and Paul Parker had been signed the season prior. Mark Hughes, Steve Bruce and Paul Ince, among others, had been part of the squad for some time but had only improved over the years. The emergence of Ryan Giggs as the top youth player in the country at 19 years of age was also a huge boost. However, it was the arrival of the forward Eric Cantona from Leeds midway through the 1992-93 season that several would argue was the main driving force behind the success that United would soon experience. This was how the table looked prior to Cantona joining United. The mercurial demeanor and sheer brilliance of the Frenchman was a true thing of beauty. He scored 9 goals in 22 matches despite only playing half the season with the club. He was essentially just what United needed to push on and finish the season on a very strong note. With Cantona and Hughes up top, as well as the efforts of the rest of the team, Ferguson succeeded in bringing the league title back to Old Trafford after almost 3 decades without it. A truly momentous occasion. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 4 years, United won the Premier League a further 3 times. This included 2 FA Cups and 1 League Cup victory too. The only blip came in the form of
another pause. This also, I'm sorry I always related back to this, but this was also during the time, this is the early 90s, that the Dallas Cowboys were very dominant. So I don't know, there's another connection. Kind of seemed like the same team.
Rovers side in 1995, funded by the millions of Blackburn local Jack Walker. Even then, the title was only won by 1 point. Although, this Rovers side would unfortunately not stand the test of time. United, on the other hand, had significantly contrasting fortunes. The departure of many, such as Paul Ince, Mark Hughes, and Steve Bruce, understandably left
Didn't
some
Rovers
big holes
get
to
in
fill.
trouble
But
financially?
the arrivals of players such as Roy Keane, Andy Cole, and Ronnie Johnson certainly helped in ensuring sustained success at the club. But that's not all. Just as Sir Matt Busby had done, Ferguson was determined to put his faith in youth as a means for building out the core of the squad. This was in spite of the famous words by Liverpool legend Alan Hansen, "You can't win anything with kids." Well, young players such as Paul Scholes, David Beckham, Phil Neville, Gary Neville, Ryan Giggs, and Nicky Butt were at the very forefront of United's success during this period. These players have since come to be known as the fabled class of '92, a nod to the fact that most of the aforementioned players won the 1992 FA Youth Cup together. These players were also part of another, larger group known as Fergie's Fledglings, a likened equivalent to the Busby Babes
Fergie's
from several
Fledglings.
decades prior. Okay, so this period of dominance was great and all on a domestic level, but on a continental level, United still left much to be desired. In all of Ferguson's years as the coach up until about 1997, United had failed to make a significant statement in the Champions League, though they did make it to the semi-finals that year. A 1-0 loss to Borussia Dortmund, the eventual winners, awaited them. Further to that, things on a domestic level were about to get a bit less comfortable. When Arsene Wenger arrived in England in 1996, like Ferguson, he inherited a rather underwhelming side. Drinking culture was rife, players were underperforming, yada yada yada, the same spiel. Except this time it was in North London. Oh, and the manager was French and not Scottish. In reality, the Arsenal side that Wenger inherited was slightly better than the United squad that Ferguson inherited, but the point still remains. The team still left a lot to be desired. In any case, Wenger virtually turned the entire club around very quickly. He brought in some incredible talents, introduced effective dieting and training regimens, and went toe-to-toe with a very strong United squad. And by the end of the 1997-98 season of the Premier League, Arsenal was sitting at the very top of the English footballing pyramid. In doing so, they managed to secure an incredible double, which also included the FA Cup. If you're Ferguson at this point, this simply won't do. Now, while Arsenal were phenomenal this season and were undoubtedly deserving champions, it can be argued that United were also going through a bit of a rough patch. At just 30 years of age, Eric Cantona, who was the captain, announced a shock retirement just before this season. Following that, Roy Keane, United's literal engine room and newly appointed captain, suffered a long-term crucial
I gotta react to
injury
Roy
early in
Keane
the
still.
season. United failed to find a way back and ultimately lost out on the league because of it. This prompted Ferguson to spend big in the transfer market in preparation for the next season. To replace the outgoing Gary Pallister, Jaap Stam was signed from PSV for £10.75 million, making him the most expensive defender in history at that time. Dwight Yorke was brought in from Aston Villa for £12.6 million, making him the club's most expensive signing in history. And Jesper Blomqvist was brought in from Parma for £4.4 million. Although the margin of defeat in the league was only 1 point as it had been against Blackburn Rovers in 1995, United had been hurt. A group of players that had known virtually nothing but victory and a manager who was obsessed with nothing but glory was shaping up to return the next season with a point to prove. So, it's at this point that we find ourselves at the beginning of the 1998-99 season of the Premier League. Before we get into the season itself, including some notable games, I felt it would be a good idea to take a look at the personnel that we're dealing with.
They're mowing
This will include the
outside. Sorry if you
tactics
hear
employed
that.
by the team, as well as the most regular starting lineup. It's important to note that this season encompassed about 63 games in total. With that in mind, it's obvious that there was not only one strict formation and set of tactics employed by the team. These would vary at differing points in the season due to squad rotation, among other factors. In any case, this is more or less how the squad set up this season. On paper, the team played in a 4-4-2 formation for the most part, most notably when out of possession. The team would press aggressively across the pitch, and if the opposition bypassed the midfield, Jaap Stam would jump forward to quell the danger and the fullbacks would tuck in. The wide players would also drop deep when required to cover those areas vacated by the fullbacks. In attack, this formation actually resembled something more akin to a 4-4-1-1, with one of the strikers holding the more advanced position and the other playing slightly deeper in the second striker role. Speaking of which, with Andy Cole and Dwight Yorke, United had the best striking partnership in all of Europe at the time. Cole was the poacher archetype in this relationship. His incredible movement off the ball and strength was perfect for United's purposes. In Yorke, United had the 1998-99 Premier League Player of the Season, a quick, skillful winger turned striker that possessed great vision as well as an incredible eye for goal. These two had a telepathic understanding of one another and would frequently switch positions mid-game when necessary. Together, Cole and York scored 53 goals over the season, roughly 42%
Wow.
of the goals scored by the team. On the flanks,
Okay.
each side of United's wide area had their own unique characteristics, something that made this team so unpredictable. On the left, Ryan Giggs and Dennis Irwin
Dennis Irwin was, my God, Dennis. Imagine if Dennis was playing now.
had somewhat of a traditional winger-fullback relationship. Irwin, who was naturally right-footed, was played as a left-back. His duties in attack would primarily be to support Ryan Giggs in a more reserved role.
Okay.
When put in a decent position, he would then be well adapted to cutting across to a stronger right foot to deliver an in-swinging cross. He could also just as easily launch one off on his left foot, which wasn't too bad either.
I would go with Dennis here, and I'm sure you would as well.
Yeah, no argument.
Giggs is surely a man that needs no introduction. A
All right.
quick,
I need
exciting
to learn
player
more
that
about
broke
Dennis
into the first
Irwin.
team at a very young age. He was more of a traditional winger than anything else, well adept at getting past his man and whipping the ball into his teammates in the box. On the right, we have a completely different story. David Beckham, whom many believe deserved the Ballon d'Or that year, was deployed as a false winger. This was due to the fact that he started matches off in the wing position but would frequently drift infield before playing that deadly final ball in. Unlike Giggs, Beckham would rarely carry the ball towards the byline before releasing it. Instead, Gary Neville would do so by moving into the empty wing space that Beckham vacated whenever
That's
he moved
interesting to
infield.
see the
As you can
defensive
imagine,
players,
this in combination with
how
Irwin
they
and
get
Giggs on
involved
the
in the
opposite
attack.
side of the field would cause opposing fullbacks and wide midfielders very many headaches. Crossing and wide play was arguably the trademark of this side, and with the four players I've just mentioned, United were frequently able to bend the opposition to their will. In the center of the pitch, the two central midfielders were typically Roy Keane and Paul Scholes. In this relationship, Roy Keane was the midfield enforcer, getting stuck into any and every challenge, very often coming out on top. His engine was essentially always running, and more often than not, he would will the team forward by his own sheer determination. More on that in a bit. Paul Scholes was the playmaker of the squad. Being positioned in a deeper holding role, he would be the guy that the ball was played into before the killer pass was made from the midfield. However, he was also a hard-working and gritty player and would often find himself on the edge of the opposition's penalty area. In this position, he would unleash ferocious shots from distance. In fact, apart from the strikers at the club, Scholes scored more goals than any other player for United in all competitions that season, with 11. Jaap Stam and Ronnie Janssen were the centre-back pairing for the team and also formed a rock-solid partnership. Stam was the more aggressive of the two, frequently stepping out to challenge the opposition. However, he would almost never stray too far from his tactical
feel like
positioning
these are the
and would
positions I
rarely be
would
caught
play if I was
overcommitting
playing.
himself. Janssen would act as the sweeper between the two, with his game more focused on covering any balls or opposition attackers that got past Stam. And finally, in goals, United had Peter Schmeichel, a legendary Danish goalkeeper that truly made his presence felt whenever he stepped between the sticks. All in all, a true shot stopper. He would also contribute immensely to the attack, as he possessed an extremely powerful kick as well as a heck of a throw. Using these traits, he was crucial when it came to starting up attacks. As I mentioned earlier, the sheer number of games that were played meant that a supporting cast was highly necessary. Players that offered incredible contributions to the team but were not regular starters included players such as Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, Teddy Sheringham, Jesper Blomqvist, Wes Brown, Phil Neville, Nicky Butt, and a few others. As a whole, this United team was absolutely stacked. Specialists in every position working in gorgeous unison to accomplish a
I
common
feel like
goal.
the midfielders
Okay, now that we have that out the way and we're all on the same page,
most
let's
impact
take a
on
look
the
at
game.
how they fared this season. Starting
Most
off with the
well-rounded
Premier League.
players.
As you would expect, Arsenal was still a huge threat in the league that season. However, a Chelsea side led by Gianluca Vialli that had just won the UEFA Cup Winners' Cup one season prior was also a surprise contender. United got off to a slow start though, drawing their first two matches, and just before the halfway point of the season, this was what the league table was looking like. However, after this match, United went on a run of 33 matches unbeaten in all competitions. But remember, just because they were unbeaten does not mean they won every match. They were still dropping points through draws, enough points to keep the title race a tight affair. This was the state of the table going into the final match of the season. Similar to the
only up
previous
by 1
season,
point.
the league seemed as though it would come down to a single point.
Really need a
One slip
win
up from
to
United and
solidify
Arsenal
it.
would have surely taken it in the end. And when Les Ferdinand scored the opening goal of United's final match of the season against Spurs, many amongst the Old Trafford faithful may have been
Tottenham.
fearing the worst. However, 2 goals on either side of half-time were enough to seal a 2-1 victory and make United Premier League champions for the 5th time in 7 years. That in itself
Nice.
is incredible. But we're not even halfway finished with this story. Remember that thing I mentioned earlier on about United's unbeaten streak in all competitions? Yeah, the thing about cup competitions is that they can only be a winner and a loser, no draws allowed. Although, the final of the FA Cup did not start off too well for them. Keane was forced off 9 minutes in due to injury. This caused the team to have to completely reorganize to find their balance once more. Having said that, I guess this wasn't too tall of a task. Sheringham came on in place of Keane and scored the first goal in what would eventually be a 2-0 win. However, throughout this FA Cup run, it was the semi-final that produced arguably the most memorable moment of the tournament. After initially drawing to Arsenal in the first semi-final match, a classic FA Cup replay was on the cards. This match started off well for United with Beckham opening the scoring. However, Dennis Bergkamp cancelled this out in the second half, and even worse, Keane was shown a second yellow card and was sent off only 5 minutes after Arsenal's equaliser. This was not good. Despite this, United was still in the game and managed to make it to extra time. And then, well, things got a bit hairy. Giggs stepped up, dribbled past everyone, and sent United through to the finals in a moment of sheer brilliance. 2 trophies down, 1 to go. Arguably the biggest of them all. Remember, United had only ever made it as far as the semi-finals of the Champions League up until this season. Sure, they'd won the Premier League a buttload of times, multiple FA Cup victories, and a Cup Winners' Cup. They were certainly worse positions to be in, and sure, the club had also won the competition when it was still called the European Cup. But come on, at this point in time, that was about 31 years prior. So, of course, that meant that there was only one thing that had to be done. You know what I mean, right? If your answer was draw 4 matches in the group stages and narrowly make it out in second place, hats off to you, because that's exactly what happened.
Really?
I do feel sorry for Brøndby though. This was literally the group of death. I mean, imagine drawing Barcelona, Man United, and Bayern Munich in the group stages. All 3 teams won their respective leagues that season. That's tough. Anyway, in the rounds that followed, United certainly didn't have an easy path to the finals. Inter Milan and Juventus in the quarterfinals and semi-finals respectively. Now, I think it's universally accepted amongst United fans that almost every match in this Champions League run was special for one reason or another. However, the second leg of the semi-final is probably the standout for very many people. This is because it produced quite possibly the best individual performance of the season and potentially even beyond that. After drawing the first game against Juventus at Old Trafford, United went 2-0 down within 11 minutes in their opposition's backyard. In steps Roy Keane with an immense captain's contribution. He scored a precious header to kickstart a comeback that would see United end the night as winners with a scoreline of 3-2. Apart from the goal, his contributions around the pitch were nothing short of astonishing. Every loose ball, every aerial duel, every 50-50, you name it, Keane was probably involved. If you don't believe me, how about Ferguson himself? In his own words, when speaking on Keane's performance, Ferguson said, "It was the most emphatic display of selflessness I have seen on a football field, pounding over every blade of grass, competing as if he would rather die of exhaustion than lose. He inspired all around him. I felt such an honor to be associated with such a player." Despite this, a yellow card he received during the match meant he would be unable to play in the final. In the final, they were matched up against a rather familiar opponent in the form of Bayern Munich, their fellow group of death survivors. If you've been following along, you've probably realized that this United team had a knack for going down early. 6 minutes in, and 1-0 to Bayern Munich. In the same vein, I'm sure you can guess what came next. United trailed in the match for 85 minutes before Teddy Sheringham came on to make it 1-1 in the 91st minute. It only took a few more seconds after that, and Solskjaer... I've got something in my throat. Sorry about that. Let's try that again. And the rest, as we say, is history. Manchester United had done it. They'd ventured out and through blood, sweat and tears had reached the promised land. Almost immediately after this incredible treble win, Alex Ferguson became Sir Alex Ferguson, as he was knighted in June of 1999. Furthermore, in the years that followed, United went on to win the Premier League a further 2 times on the trot. This made them the only team ever to win 3 Premier League titles in a row, the feat that's only ever been accomplished twice, both times by Manchester United squads managed by Ferguson. Every now and then in football, a team just hits that sweet spot where just about every player in the squad is in their physical and mental prime. Combine that with a relentless and tactically astute manager, and what you have is a team that's impossible to forget. Now, with that in mind, it was obvious that this team would never last forever. Father Time is undefeated, and the collective motivations of large groups of people are difficult to maintain in general, especially with regards to sports at this level. By 2003, most of the squad were already gone with only a few still remaining. But remember who we're dealing with here. Under the guidance of Ferguson and the incredible United backroom staff, the club would soon have their day in the sun once more. However, perhaps that's a story for another day. In any case, I think we can all agree that this was an exceptional achievement. Perhaps we'll be lucky enough to witness it again for just about any club in the Premier League. Until then, we're left with the memory of the most successful singular season from an English team to date. Manchester United,
That's amazing.
Treble winners. And there we have it. I'd be interested to know what you all think of this incredible Man United squad. In your opinion, when it comes to all of Europe, where do you think they rank in terms of not only their achievements, but also the abilities of the players and the manager alike? Feel free to drop your thoughts in the comments below. In any case, I had a blast compiling this one together. Hope you enjoyed it. Cheers, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Alright, well, we know he had a blast compiling the video because he is a unashamed United fan. I love his content. He makes really good creative videos that are very, very informative. So it's helpful for me to learn the history of football by watching this video. Wow, Manchester United reminds me actually a lot more of my beloved Cowboys than I was expecting. They, man, they went through a very long period of having very little success, and then they had a lot of success for a sustained period for almost a decade, and then they then they struggled again for quite a few years up until recently. They look maybe like they're coming back, but maybe not really. So yeah, United, man, very interesting history. I need to dive into more of the United history because I know that it's very, very rich. I need to dive into the Munich air disaster. I want to actually read more about that. And there was a couple other moments in United history that some of you guys commented that I needed to look up. So I'll be looking forward to reading your comments on this video. If you liked what you saw, you can consider subscribing to the channel, liking this video. Man, if you hit like, it really helps me out. The likes on the videos actually help these videos get seen by more people, and the comments as well. So if you have anything to say, just like say hi or the number 7 or I don't know, something random. You can say whether or not you love United or you hate United. Just kind of leave a comment down below, because the more you engage with the videos, the more YouTube says, hey, that's a good video. People seem to like it, and it'll show it to more people. So there's all of that. There's also Patreon. You can click the link in the description. I've been watching Ted Lasso over there with my Patreon subscribers. You can do that or join channel memberships here on YouTube. Both of you get Ted Lasso reactions there. All right. That being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.